Hello, and welcome to Blockade. Now, as you notice, my lovely printer, which has been well used today, is currently serving as a lovely holder for a Steve Dunn book, Blockade, which is all about cruiser warfare and the starvation of Germany in World War One. It's one of my favourite of his books, and it's a very, very good one. Today's topic, of course, is to Blockade, but before we get into it, I'm going to make a couple of announcements. One, 4 random books will be returning soon. 2, and this is even more important, I now got both Patreon open for those people who wish to support this channel and suggest and vote for topics. Currently, suggestions are open on Patreon, so please, if you would like to suggest a topic, please do. And as you'll notice when we get to the end of this video and we're talking about the lives coming up, all 3 lives this month are from patrons. And the reason for that is because there was a draw for number 2. And I should have said that in the event there's a draw for number 2, I get the casting vote to make my life easier. But I didn't. Possibly because I'm too kind. Or because I enjoy the history too much. We'll go with the latter. So, that's what patrons get. But you also, if you want to support this channel and you feel like doing something more than just super chats, or doing, as well as super chats, because super chats are very much loved. Every time I have a super chat, I mentally add it onto the Iron Brew Fund. Which is important because at the moment I'm surviving off Sprite because the co-ops have run out of Iron Brew. Someone is blockading my area for Iron Brew. If I find out who, there will be a revenge. But leaving that to one side. If you join the channel, what do you get? You get a special icon next to your name when you comment, and when you chat during the lives. You also get some special emojis, which includes a Blackburn emoji and a Beef Wellington emoji and 2 others. And the more people who join, the more emojis which I get to create. So eventually, Cult of the Catalina, there will be one. Those people asking for the bow of HMS Eskimo, a bowless HMS Eskimo, there definitely will be one. Those people who would like a Tog 2 emoji, I know who you are. Maybe. Especially as Drac has promised to teach me how to do the circular things so I can make them better for emojis. And finally, well, I hope you enjoy. As I often point out with these videos, these long patrols, sometimes I do a pre-recorded video which is going to set up an entire strata of other videos. So it's explaining key points. And sometimes it's a whole thing in one go and it's multiple videos. This is going to be one longer video, but it is going to underpin a lot of future videos. So I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, today's topic. To close, distant, loose, or Pacific. Blockade. So here are the definitions, and you'll notice that I have gone for Cambridge Dictionary and Wikipedia. I could have gone for many others. I could have gone for Steve Dunn's definition of blockade, which is a rather cool one. Which is... apart from offensive duties, the task of the Navy is to keep the sea lanes open for the importation of goods into its mother's country, and equally to deny and interdict trade to its enemy. This was the unglamorous and uncongenial job the Royal Navy carried out for 4 long years. In quotidian, unheard-of actions and patrols, largely unrecognised, often dull, seldom less than dangerous, the Navy kept the vital arteries of trade open, despite strategic mishaps, such as the delay in the introduction of convoy, and, equally important, denied freedom of seas and of trade to Germany and her allies. By the concluding days of the war, Germany was starving, literally starving to death. The pressure for an armistice by Germany in 1918 was as much driven by losses and stalemate on the battlefields as it was by the collapse of morale and order at home. Hunger stalked the land, and anarchy and Bolshevism followed in its wake, and soldiers, seeing their kith and kin were in no way benefiting from their own sacrifices in the trenches, lost both the will to fight and their confidence in the Kaiser, court and general staff. And this hunger was because of the British naval blockade, maintained throughout the seasons and years, which crippled German industry and reduced food supplies to starvation levels. Now, I know nowadays there is a vogue of saying, oh, we're going to blockade this shop or something like that. Please don't. A blockade is a very, very blunt and very strong tool which nation states use. If you are forming a human wall of citizens around another citizen-owned place, you're not blockading it, you're forming a human wall. It's a protest. It's a very important protest sometimes, especially if they're very, very terrible shops. But I'm having to keep my language okay for YouTube. This is the fourth attempt at this. I kept spelling words. It caused them trouble. But it's not a blockade. Now the question is, why is a blockade different from a siege or similar things? Well, because blockades are often less violent but more solid than sieges, and also longer running. In a siege, you tend to be lobbing something in at the defenders and preparing to make an attack. So basically, you're besieging with them with the specific point of weakening them so you can take the place from them. A blockade isn't so much about taking a place as it is about starving a place or stopping something getting into the place or stopping stuff getting out. One is more of a very aggressive police action. The other one, war-y. So one of the most famous examples of blockade is, of course, Scott's Great Snake, the Anaconda Plan. Gorgeous in its simplicity, deadly in its delivery, and so freaking obvious one has to wonder why no one in the South, if they were actually preparing for war, rather than thinking they were going to somehow walk it, why do politicians always think it's going to be easy? Would have actually thought about. To solve it for the South, they would have needed proper east-west lines of communication, i.e. at least a single railway line, if not two, running east to west, with some north-south lines connecting those two lines as well, so you could move goods around quite easily and personnel around. And I don't know, probably put industry in more places than just Richmond. And have a plan for your capital so your capital doesn't end up in Richmond. The South were really, the Confederacy was a really badly thought through strategic idea. The thing is, the North had enough industry to maintain a navy, which meant it could get the supplies of raw material, cotton, etc. from elsewhere in the world it needed to operate and keep its economy functioning. It could import stuff across the way from Canada, which it shared a border with. All these things are strategic assets. The South. Well, the South is the classic example of an aristocracy which has got itself into trouble. In that they are so enjoying their particular way of life, they haven't noticed the world changing around them. And thankfully, Frankfurt North, they didn't, because otherwise it would have made the war a lot more bloody and a lot longer. But, you know, yes, the riverboats work great, and we've got excellent riverboats, but the rivers only flow to the sea. And you need things to connect between to move stuff. And oh, look at all this industry, these train engines and things we're importing from Europe and America and the northern cities. But why aren't you building them in the south? It's good for a short-term war, it's bad for a long-term war. And Scott's plan worked. Because Scott's plan was always going to work. Because it is destroying the southern economy. They can neither export the raw goods, which their wealth is based off, and to make viable and to actually make money at this time with the way they're processing it, required the use of huge amounts of unpaid, badly treated labour. And please, no one comment on the here with there were plantations which were good. There is no such thing as a good plantation. Okay? None. Doesn't matter whether it's a villa in Roman England or a plantation in the Caribbean or a plantation in South America. There is no such thing as a good place to be unpaid labour or slaves. No matter what you call it. But that's what they depended upon. To get them money. But the trouble is, that's lovely. We export that. We then use the money to pay for the importation of manufactured goods. So you have no manufactured goods yourself. Or virtually no. And you are dependent on exporting raw materials to pay for those manufactured goods. A blockade only has to be 55 or 60% effective to work in this scenario. Because this economy is dependent upon exporting stuff. Okay, so let's say you only intercept 60% of that. Whew. Right, so they've only got 40%. That can therefore only pay for 40% of the imports they need, and this is wartime, so they probably need more imports than they normally would need. But they can only afford to pay now for 40%. Then that 40% comes back, and you're a 60% effective blockade. I intercept 36% of that, so only 4%. Oh, let's say, actually, no, let's be nice. Let's say I intercept 24% of it. 16% of that gets through. So I have 16% of the manufactured goods I need to produce the stuff I need to export to pay for manufactured goods. And I'm fighting a war. So probably the manufactured goods I've imported aren't actually necessarily good for me producing the stuff. So then I try and produce, and maybe next year I get 50% of what I normally produce. Export it. But only 20% gets through. Then stuff goes back. 60% effective again. Only 8% gets in. And it just keep. Your blockade doesn't have to be that effective. It only has to be 60 or so % effective to have a big impact. This is why all the blockade runners and things that are made such a fuss of in history are wonderful colour in the history. They're lovely bits of gobbets of little bits of information and cool things to talk about. But ultimately, they mean zilch. Because it's constantly diminishing returns. And eventually, your economy is going to crumble. Or you're going to end up sending troops into battle where they are going to be launching stones from treetops at soldiers armed with rifles and bayonets. Or Turkey is great. The lessons of the First World War are the reasons why Nazi Germany pursued it so heavily prior to World War II, but they never managed to achieve it. The South never fall that far ahead. So let's look at the definitions of close blockade. Well, There was a recent example of a close blockade, or an attempt at one. Jersey in 2021. The French fishermen tried to do a close blockade of Jersey. And Royal Navy OPVs turned up, and everyone else turned up and was looking at them and going, and eventually they went home. Now, normally, here's the thing. When you're doing a blockade, you don't do an all-close blockade. It's one of the interesting things that the Great Snake, the Anaconda Plan, had so much of it being a close blockade, i.e. the ships being very close inshore. This is why the Merrimac, etc., and the Monitor were able to be effective. Because it was nice inshore waters, which they were viable in for quite a lot of the time. They weren't really viable out further at sea. And wonder why there's the interesting conversation when people go, start to do debate, which I covered a while back, of Warrior versus the Monitor, and which one would have won in that fight. And it's a case of, well, where is it? Is it in an area where is the Warrior anchored? Are they unable to move? And the Monitor able to just go round it and try and get in its blind spot and keep firing at it? In which case, yes. If not, then if they're out in actual open water, then the Monitor's probably going to sink from water before actually anyone bothers to shoot at it. And it's the same with the sort of the Scots Plan. It's a close blockade. So if you're doing a close blockade, normally what happens, and this is a good example of this is at Brest and various other places, is fleets would have a blockading squadron, which would normally be led by a 5th rate, maybe a 4th rate, depending on the port, and would mostly be composed of brig sloops, i.e. smaller ships, which would get in nice and close inshore. But if the enemy fleet sails suddenly and manages to catch them, then that's not a problem. They are gone. It's not a big loss to us. Hopefully they get the warning off, because you keep your bigger fleet further away, so they're safe. I.e., so when there's a storm, etc., or something like that, they're not dashed against rocks because they're close inshore. But it does depend upon how many harbours you're blockading, how big a fleet you have, what kind of blockade you go for. It really does depend, and it also is what kind of strategy you're going for. Do you want to psych out your enemy and unnerve them? In which case, maybe keeping beyond visual range is good. Do you want to intimidate them the whole time by having regular sounding of cannon, firing, tolling the time out all night as signal that the ship's okay? Well, you put them as close as you possibly can, so the citizens of the harbour have to hear that cannon boom, boom, boom whenever the clock tolls. Which, again, some Royal Navy captains would do quite happily to scare the bejesus out of people. The British blockading system, of course, did actually end up getting responses. So, after the Battle of Trafalgar, the war wasn't over. It wasn't. And what it does do is it's destroyed enough of Napoleon's fleet and enough of Napoleon's experienced naval personnel that he cannot quickly rebuild a fleet. There are various sources which say he doesn't bother, he disbands his fleet. He doesn't. It's going to take him forever. We all know how interesting the French yards are. I've recently been doing videos about the French dreadnoughts. Don't think they got that way overnight. It turned 1900, all the French shipyards suddenly went, you know what, we're going to go completely loco. No. They were like that for a long, long time. So, Napoleon wanted to enforce a blockade on Britain without being able to enforce a blockade on Britain, because his idea was this: Britain is dependent upon trade with Europe to make its money. Okay, so we'll get into this, but you know. And his next point in that thinking was, I control Europe because there is the dark green, directly administered. There is the light green, which are client states. And then there's other nations which are technically part of the continental system. Small problem. Small problem. He announces this after he's taken Berlin, and that's in November 1806. He decides to start really sort of pushing things. And it is a response to the British blockade of him, which they started in May 1806. He develops his continental system. And the idea is you can't trade with Britain. But the trouble is, he doesn't have ships to enforce this. And Britain does have ships. Lots of ships. So the British turn to smuggling, which undermines Napoleonic rule pretty much everywhere. In fact, I think one of the biggest centres of smuggling that there was at this point was Brittany. I think also Normandy had quite a lot of British smuggling going on to it as well. Basically, anywhere you can think of that could have smuggling had smuggling going on, with the British quite happy to let it happen, even though they were technically blockading ports, but they were very happy to let their own smugglers through. Can't think why. The British opened up trade elsewhere in the world. It did cause problems for the UK at home. There was a whole Luddite movement and various other things which are upset with the war and various issues. But more, it kicked off the Peninsula campaign by upsetting Portugal and eventually Spain. It led to Napoleon deciding to invade Russia because they weren't enforcing it properly, in his opinion, which caused the whole march on Moscow and the fiasco after that. Oh, and it led to the Anglo-American War of 1812, but we'll get into that one a bit later. It's a fun thing. And it doesn't work. Because ultimately, the British economy diversifies, and the British have, again, notice a common pattern here, they have control of the sea. So, this is like the South in the American Civil War announcing that they were not trading with the Union. Yeah, so we can trade elsewhere. Admittedly, some of the responses from Britain is probably not particularly nice, you know. It's not very fun to be in India at this point, etc. They're making a lot of money out there. But this was a consequence of Napoleon, which was a consequence of the British blockade of Napoleon, which is a consequence of, which is able to be done thanks to the Battle of Trafalgar, but is a consequence of Napoleon's moves to attack Britain. Basically, Britain and France don't get along, and it just gets worse when France gets a new form of government. But the continental system is pretty... how do I put this? Heavy-handed, even by Napoleonic standards. Napoleon comes up with the Code Napoleon and many other things. He is often quite a subtle thinker. He's not the greatest general of all time, but there is always the often quoted thing of, you know, planting trees along roads. The reason is because they'll provide shade for troops when they're marching in 20 years' time, that sort of thing. He thinks things through. He thinks long term. Honestly, Britain must have managed to wind him up something chronic to get him to go for something so heavy-handed and short-termist as the continental system. And think it would work. Loose blockade. Well, most famous example of loose blockade is probably the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade by the Royal Navy. But honestly, most blockades are loose blockades when you're talking about enforcing them. That is usually what they are. They are loose because you don't want to get too close to the coast. You either want to be in harbour or you want to be in open waters. You don't want to be in confined waters and not in a safe place, because then you're in trouble the moment a storm hits or someone gets ideas about inventing the submarine. And which leads us into the next discussion. Is unrestricted submarine warfare a blockade? It's an interesting debate. Honestly, it is. And my answer is no. And I have a reason for this. I would say because in blockades, normally you are seizing the ships. That's often what you do, and you have various methods of doing that, as we'll be talking later. The Royal Navy has a habit of buying the cargo that they developed sort of about World War One point, and various other nations have various other techniques. Sinking ships is a last resort, really, in a blockade, because it is economic warfare. I would say submarine warfare is siege warfare. Because it is far more about taking life, destroying things, than it is taking stuff and simply stopping it in there. So I would say submarine warfare is more trying to lay siege to your enemy through maritime means. It is a form of blockade, yes, but because it goes on there, it's more akin to a siege than it is to a blockade. But that's an interesting point of debate, and I'm sure we'll get to it in live at some point. And when we're discussing the various points of submarine warfare, I'm very sure it will come up again. Hopefully, so far you've noticed that there are several avenues this video is hoping to open up and develop for future. Next, neutral rights. Now, this is Tom Freeman's painting, and I think it's one of my favourite paintings, but I also think it's slightly inaccurate. Because, to my knowledge, the White House was painted white after the fire of 1814 to cover up the burn scorch marks on the brickwork. But I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong. Neutral rights are an issue whenever you do a blockade. What rights do you give neutrals? Do you give them any rights? In theory, neutrality means you can trade with both sides. But they don't like it. As you saw with the continental system when Napoleon implemented it earlier. He was claiming everyone was basically under his control and couldn't do it. When if Britain had gone, we're neutral, we're going to start trading with the South, well, that would have solved the South's problems, but they didn't do it because it would have interfered in the war, and because, honestly, they didn't like the South as much as the South thought they did. And when you're doing submarines, well, at what range will the submarine be able to tell the flag and country of the nation that owns the ship it's torpedoing? Half the problems in World War One are caused by the Germans putting torpedoes in ships which are neutrals or carrying neutrals. There are complex issues around neutrality. In World War II, we have talked about the Asamamaru incident of 1940. We've talked about the SS Vincent de Paul incident or the Tsingtao incident of 1939. These events happen around neutral shipping. The Vincent de Paul is theoretically a British flagship trading with Chinese in an area which the Japanese claimed occupying control. The Asama is a Japanese version of the Queen Elizabeth. Basically, it's a Pride of Joy liner, and she's carrying German sailors from America, also technically neutral at this point, to Japan to try and travel over the Asia route and land route to Germany. Bring in Sepset. Neutral issues do not go away. At the very least, the blockading power will want to search ships for contraband, i.e. things they do not want getting in. Potentially impound, seize them, or buy them. And it gets even more enjoyable when you have the press gang as one of your major recruiting tools, and you have one of the major states that's trading at this point. Most of its people do not have an American accent. Most of them have still what could be a British accent or an Irish accent, i.e. countries you can impress from. So they might claim to be American, but and good sailors are in hard demand. It all causes issues. So what is a Pacific blockade? Well, it's not necessarily in the Pacific. Technically, it's supposed to be a blockade carried out during peacetime. The first blockade is to do with the Greeks trying to get their independence from the Ottomans, and results in a pretty one-sided battle between the Allies, who are the Royal Navy, the French Navy, and the Russian Navy, under command of a Royal Navy Vice Admiral, and the combined Ottoman-Egyptian fleet, which doesn't do that well. They try. They certainly do the best they can, but the trouble is they are facing a fairly decent Royal Navy squadron under a fairly good commander. Again, it's something for future discussions. The Battle of Navarino is a kind of interesting battle, but yeah. The second time it's implemented, the British blockade the New Republic of New Grenada to compel the release of a British imprisoned consul. They decided to release him. Honestly, as a rule, blockade should work best against island nations, because when you control the sea access, they get nothing. But, as America would tell you, with Cuba, it becomes problematic when there is a very, very powerful ally, or technically neutral in the involvement, who keeps wanting to send their ships there, and you don't want a war with them. Cuba, the gift that keeps giving. So, sanctions and embargoes. What are they? Well, they are more technically finicky things that you can put in now with more modern states. Remember what I said, that the blockade is kind of a sledgehammer? It's kind of a massive tool. Well, you can be more scalpel-like with sanctions and embargoes. Economic sanctions technically are embargoes in some respects. Typically a ban on trade, with certain exceptions, such as food and medicine can be allowed through an embargo. That's often one. Food and medicine will be allowed through. But even then, the food and medicine will be closely watched, because if there's certain chemicals or things, they could, of course, be used for weapons. Diplomatic sanctions, i.e. the removal of diplomatic ties and sending home of embassies. This is quite a big affront to a nation, as it stops being able to trade and communicate with you. But expect it to be reciprocal if you do it. Military sanctions, i.e. the setting up of a no-fly zone. That is a military sanction. And again, all of these tend to require, especially in the modern circumstances, the agreement of a multinational body. Now, traditionally this was the United Nations as it was set up with, but more recently you have seen things like the European Union and NATO flex terribly close to implementing the equivalence or actually implementing it by backdoors. Sports sanctions, particularly useful against dictatorships which like to exploit such events by going, no, you can't come. Particularly unappreciated by sports personnel as persons who tend to like to compete against the best from wherever they are in the world, no matter what kind of dictatorship or weird country they come from. Hey ho. Sanctions on the environment. Well, these are again some of the more recent ones. And you will find specific chemicals, if they harm the ozone layer, are blocked. And specific endangered species, you cannot trade in that. And again, implementing them and implementing all these is quite difficult because they tend to have to be multinational, i.e. you have to have more than one country involved. And they have to be intelligence-led because you have a lot of trade going and no one wants to disrupt it as much as a blockade. That's why they're doing sanctions. No one wants the paperwork and the stress and the disrupted global trade of a blockade. So they're doing the sanction route, which means you need intelligence, both in terms of this and in terms of information, to actually figure it out and implement it and do it and find the things before they get to where they're supposed to not go. And then there's sanctions on individuals, which is pretty much a travel ban, but it can also be a, if you are caught abroad, you will go straight to The Hague. Always good, that one. So, to close or distant blockade. Well, you notice I didn't put something there called an information blockade sanctions or information blockades, but of course I think that could be the next generation, blocking a country off from the internet. I could honestly see some countries like China trying to block off the outside world from their own internet, i.e. do a blockade on the rest of the world. So, and what's always interesting about those cable routes is they also mirror quite a lot of the global maritime trade going on. If you remember when I put that map up. To close or distant blockade in the modern world would be an interesting task. If a country is dependent upon importing raw materials, it will probably be affected more quickly unless it can find adequate sources to keep those raw material supplies going. A country which is dependent upon trade for its entire economy, i.e. importation of raw materials, exportation of manufactured goods to keep its economy viable, is probably the weakest to the form of coercion that blockade represents. Such an economy would, as I pointed out earlier, it doesn't require that effective a blockade to start having a serious impact very quickly on what's going on. The more effective a blockade you implement, the more quickly it will have an impact. So is it a close blockade or distant blockade? Well, that's a false question. In World War I, we would call what the British did to the Germans, and in World War II, what the British did to the Germans, a distant blockade. That's quite true. But did it need to be that close? No. In World War I, it was far more effective because the Germans didn't have control of Norway. So the British mucked up there. But they still managed to keep the blockade on, and they managed to keep the supplies coming through. The Germans, in contrast, didn't manage to implement a blockade. They had Britain under a siege, in that they were limiting the supply, trying to limit the supplies getting through by attacking them, but they weren't blockading the supplies of their submarines. So the question really should be, to blockade or not to blockade? honestly, if you can do it, a blockade can be a very effective means of not only wrecking your opponent's economy, but wrecking their ability to wage war. But you have to be able to do it. As the Anaconda Plan showed, a blockade against a power which has continental as well as maritime borders, well, the maritime can be blockaded, but you need to make sure you also do something about the land. You need to find a way to weaken their ability to maneuver there. Either way, it's going to put you in a difficult position of difficult decisions. Things which often modern leaders don't seem to like that much. Anyway. So what have we got coming up? Well, 10th of June, Felix B. History of East Indian Company Merchantmen and Differences to Ships of the Line. I know which battle that came from. And then it's the Age of Iron on the 13th of June. 27th of June, Patron 26. Dan Freeman, the Great Siege of Gibraltar. 24th of June, Patron 27. Andronor, Actions of the French Navy Model 1. And 27th of June, Brew Ships 52, A Year of Brew Ships. Long patrols I've got coming up. 15th of June, Operation Ariel. 20th of June, Battle of the Philippine Sea. 22nd of June, Camperdown Rams Victoria. 29th of June, Battle of Athos. 3rd to 11th of July, the sea power behind the Ring of Stone. So basically I'm going to be doing a castle a day, and I'm just picking 8 to 9 castles. It's lovely. My own channel, so I get to pick castles if I want to. Right, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this, and well, thank you for those people who are watching. Thank you to anyone who's liked and who's subscribed, and thank you to everyone who's shared. Thank you to everyone who's patron, who's joined the community, who has joined Discord and chatting away there. Thank you. I really can't say enough how much you all mean to me. Thank you. Take care. Have a good evening, and I hope you found this little discussion of blockades useful.